Welcome to the Church Leadership Podcast, your weekly source for encouraging and equipping local church leaders, with your hosts, Mark Gainey and Andy Frazier. In each episode, Andy and Mark sit down with church leaders that you should know. We believe these honest conversations will be helpful and encouraging to you as you lead the local church. Here is this week's episode.
Welcome to episode 115 of the Church Leadership Podcast. We're so excited and thankful that you have joined us for today's episode. And it's a conversation that we hope you enjoy, but mainly we hope encourages you and equips you to better lead in the local church. And want to remind you before we get to the conversation that we encourage you to subscribe to the podcast, whether it's on your favorite podcast listening app or on YouTube if you're watching. And we ask that you rate the podcast as well. You can do that really quickly and easily. Go to ratethispodcast.com/CLP to do that. And now today's conversation is between Andy and I. So here's today's conversation.
We're glad you joined us on the episode this week that Mark and I get to talk amongst ourselves. Mark, right. If this episode was sponsored by anybody, I'm guessing it would be sponsored by the Church Leadership Podcast.
Right. Or Coffee Talk.
Yeah. So the Church Leadership Podcast today is sponsored by the Church Leadership Podcast.
That's right.
We're talking to each other.
And speaking of that, we're excited because we do have some sponsors coming on.
Yes.
That we'll tell you about in days to come, but we're excited about
that. We have way more going on than we realized. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about today. Just kind of catch you up on where we are and a few things about us. Maybe too much information, maybe not. I don't know. We'll see. But we just wanted to kind of share our hearts for a little while today, talk with you guys and let you know where we are and what we're learning, what we're experiencing and how we're maybe struggling or striving or thriving even. So
hey, there you go.
Yeah. So we're glad to have this time.
Yes, we are. So if you remember, if you've been following our podcast any length of time, or if you're new, this is going to be new information to you. But every 5 episodes, at least every 5 episodes, Andy and I try to just sit down and talk with each other about a certain topic, something going, or as it happens today, just catch you up. And I will say before we even get to the questions that we're going to talk about, just to catch you up on the podcast, we're so thankful for all of you. The Church Leadership Podcast Army, it's growing. And, we've spent more time at certain times and less time at certain times building the podcast and marketing, things like that. But God continues to grow it. And you guys are faithful to not only listen and watch, but to share it with other people. So thank you so much. And we're excited about the future of the podcast. And so having said that, this is kind of a catch up. So we're going to ask each other really simple questions today. And it's something that I would encourage you to ask one another, to ask your staff, to ask other people that you disciple or mentor, or your Paul or Barnabas. And so the first question, Andy, I'm going to ask you is, what has God been teaching you lately, either about just your individually as a follower of Christ, as a disciple leader, or as a pastor? What is God revealing to you and teaching you?
Well, in the midst of what God's teaching me, let me just kind of piggyback off of what you said earlier. I'm thankful for the podcast too. And God is teaching me a lot through this podcast. And one of the things I'm learning is where to make sure we prioritize our time and where to make sure we leave margin. And there are seasons where we can invest more time in endeavors like this podcast. And then there are seasons like you and I are going through right now where just struggling to come up from air some days, so so sometimes we don't have as much time to invest in this podcast as we would like, but I'm so thankful for it. And God is teaching me a lot through the podcast. But personally, right now, I feel like the summer after COVID is a lot crazier and busier than the summer of 20, right in the middle of COVID.
No doubt.
Mainly because we're rebounding a lot. I'm sure everybody who's watching and listening kind of feels the same pressure. And that is not necessarily to try to get back to exactly how things were, but how do we get to where we need to be? And that melding and blending of trying to find balance and restore some order plus plan ahead, that's a little bit of chaos, a whole lot of faith, there. So that's kind of what I'm learning is try to kind of just take one step at a time and follow God's leading and the Holy Spirit's giving me discernment. And I'm sure he is a lot of you as well, but there are moments where it's clearer and some days where it's a little foggier to know what steps to take. So that's one thing. The other thing is really enjoying time with family. We've gotten some opportunities the last several weeks to spend time with our family, and that's been great. Gearing up as we're recording this podcast, I'll be in Tennessee at youth camp with our church's youth camp and with Mark's church's youth group. So we're going to have a crazy busy week this week. I get to spend time with our student minister and some adult volunteers and some students. So I'm excited about that. But one of the things God's teaching me is to remain flexible and willing to just do whatever I need to do, because I'm a little bit of I wouldn't say a control freak, but I'm a little bit of a person who likes order, and I like to be able to plan. So when those things kind of change and I feel like that control is taken away from me, I tend to get off balance a little bit. So this week is definitely going to be a week where that's going to be tested. I'm not in control. I'm just along for the ride, and that'll be interesting. But during all this planning and craziness and busyness and podcast stuff, one of the things God is really, really burning in my heart right now is to make sure that I lead and develop leaders well, so that I can delegate. Right now is really key. I'm asking a lot of people, leaning on a lot of people to do some things that I just don't have the time, the margin, or the bandwidth to do. So, and that's a trust factor. You got to trust God and you got to trust people. So those are some of the things that I'm learning right now, Mark. What about you? What's God teaching you?
Well, you and I joke all the time, Andy, that we share the same brain sometimes. And I think God brought us together several years ago because we share so many of the same experiences, and we go through the same things sometimes quicker and sometimes slower, sometimes at different points. But a lot of what you just said is really what God's been working with me on. And the number one thing I would tell you that he's teaching me is trust. And it's like a continual thing. I mean, I really believe I've been learning this lesson for 30 years now, and I still haven't learned it, but God's just teaching me all over again how to trust in him. And it's built around a lot of what you talked about. Proverbs says, trust in the Lord with all your heart, your own understanding, and all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. That doesn't mean that he's going to make your path smooth, right? Doesn't mean that it's going to be all fine and dandy, but he will direct your paths, really is what that means. And so my tendency, just honestly, I'm like you. Maybe I'm not a control freak, but I'm a control preferred person, right? And so my tendency is to try to make things happen, or try to engineer or manipulate the situation so that what I want happens. And again, God, I think, just laughs at me and says, trust in me. And I'll just give you some quick examples. So one of them, of course, is this post-COVID world we're living in. We talk about it a lot on the podcast. We ask a lot of questions to our guests about that very thing. And, in that world, I know what I think should happen. And I have this idea of the way we should do things, but God's idea sometimes is very different. So one example is June is a terrible time to launch anything new, right? June is a terrible time to begin an emphasis, because vacations start, Memorial Day, all that stuff is going on around this time. Well, we knew that our people are beginning to come back after COVID. Ours are kind of slower, I think, than some others. And so, we're still every other pew kind of thing, and it's getting crowded. And so we wanted to create some more space, especially for our seniors that are returning. Plus, our worship service is mainly contemporary. We have hymns in it too, but we also wanted to reward those faithful senior saints that have been giving, have been they're online every single week, and they're learning how to get online in the first place, and they're worshiping with us online. And so we said, why don't we start a new service that's just traditional? Nobody's starting traditional service anymore, right? Well, we're going to in June, when we should start nothing. And I'll be honest with you, that goes back to that Philippians verse. Don't be anxious about anything. Well, I'm going to confess to you, I was anxious. I was anxious that nobody would show up. I was anxious that it wouldn't work. I was anxious that people would get angry. All those things that we tell you not to do, I was doing it. Okay. And, but let me tell you something. God is so good because he had that engineered. He had that planned better than I could have ever planned. And, so that in experiencing all that, it's almost like God saying, I told you so. I told you to trust in me. Another example of that would be, we needed transportation for this student trip that you're just talking about, Andy. And we raised money for a 26 passenger bus, and man, time was getting close to leave for camp and we didn't have a bus yet. And so I'd hate to spend that, money on renting a bus, that kind of thing. And, those silly things that we begin to worry about. God provided a bus that's 14 years old, but only 7,000 miles on it. And so it was a great price. Looks almost brand new. God's good that way. And it's almost, again, like you said, I told you, trust in me. And so I'm learning, I guess, in a good way, rather than a negative way, to trust in him all the more. And the other thing that he's been teaching me is exactly what you mentioned, and that's margin. We talk about margin all the time. We talk about leaving the white space on the edge of the paper. And we talk about, having that rhythm of rest and work. But I'm just going to be transparent with our podcast audience. I have been doing a poor job of that the last month. And I've had some deadlines and some things. And, we've had the podcast every week coming up, and we've had church, Andy and I are pastors. And so there are certain things we've been kind of, in that boiling pot with. And I failed to take the margin I need to, and, began to get tired and worn out, and, just realized I'm not doing what I preach. I'm not practicing what I preach. And so over the next few weeks, even though our life is crazy busy, we are going to take some time and we're going to have some margin. And so I'm thankful that it didn't take something really bad to remind me of the need to have margin. So those are the two main things I think God is teaching me so far.
Yeah, this time 2 years ago, I learned the lesson the hard way when I was recovering from surgery at home from an injury to my leg, and had lots of margin then, but it was,
yes, you did. It was way more margin than you wanted.
And what you're talking about, Mark, let's kind of unpack that, from both of our perspectives on this. And here's what I'm finding. It's not necessarily the big things that catch us off guard so much as it is a combination of the stacking on of lots of small things.
Yes.
And I think that's a discipline to be able to say yes at the right time and no at the right time, or wait at the right time. I think that's something that we're always being tested on. I don't think that's something you ever come to a place where you're just completely confident that you've conquered all of that and you can move on to, whatever issue you're facing. I think it's just those small little things that build up over time. That's where I have anxiety or discouragement over, is how to deal with this plethora of all these small things coming at me.
Yep.
Because most of the time you can anticipate or plan for or adjust to the big things, but all these small things that come at you, it's kind of hard.
No doubt. And, death by 1,000 cuts, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's really what we can experience in ministry if we're not careful. So great word. I got another question.
Yeah.
That we didn't talk about, and it may take a minute for you to think about this, but I think it would be cool for us to talk about. Again, just our goal every podcast is to have a conversation with one another or with our guests that you get to listen to, and hopefully it's helpful and encouraging. But I'm going to ask this question. So we're in midway of 2021. We are halfway home and thinking about church and ministry, or even personal life, right? What the next 6 months before we close the books of 2021, what are you wanting to see happen in the next 6 months? What's next, I guess, for you, for either you or for Grace as you lead there?
Well, based on the previous 6 months, it is a whole lot of enjoying God's blessings and trying to walk in faithfulness and steward kind of the resources and relationships and things that he's blessed us with. I mean, because if the last 6 months is any indication for what God has in store for us, the podcast, I mean, buckle your seatbelts. Right. We've had some great things happen. I was just sitting there thinking, as you were talking about everything that's going on, we probably haven't highlighted enough good things in the last few minutes that we've talked about. And one of the things that we constantly discuss when we go off air of the podcast is the guests we have week in and week out. I mean, it is just so helpful, so encouraging to you and me. And the people who we don't really know that well, we feel like we've made friends, not just some kind of acquaintance or networking with a peer or learning from somebody that's further down the road with us. We feel like we've made friends with somebody. So the next 6 months, I look forward to more of that here on the podcast, meeting more new people and having conversations with them as far as ministry goes in the local church. The Lord's really blessed our church. I had a conversation last week and another conversation this week with two different people who were first-time guests at our church, who really, one guy, he hadn't been in church in 20 something years. Another guy today lost his wife a few years ago. Has been kind of bitter and angry with God. And both of those had deep spiritual conversations based on the questions they had. And, praying for both of those guys. So if more of that's to come, I'm excited about that. We're trying to dig a little bit deeper and go a little bit further with some of our people who have gone through being discipled, and kind of encouraging and equipping them to push on and multiply, and getting some more groups started. And then just some great opportunities right now for community ministry in our area that I'm really excited about. And then to top that off, we've got our sons are in different phases in life. And we've got both of our sons are going to a school. My oldest son started there a couple of years ago. Our middle son's starting there now, and our oldest son's going to be a senior this year. It's hard to believe. I know you're way older than me and have kids way older than me. You're already experienced that twice over, but I'm excited to see what God's going to do in and through the lives of our sons, and how my wife, man, she's a champ, how she takes care of everything and keeps me straight. So I'm excited about this next 6 months for our family.
That's awesome.
What about you?
Well, I'm going to go in reverse order that you just did. So I'll do the same, but I'll go in reverse order. So family wise, it's kind of crazy. So we just had one graduate, and she's going to college in the fall, and she'll be going to Troy. I did not force her to go there. I didn't, but she'll be going to Troy. And then in October, we've got our first wedding. So my oldest daughter is getting married, which is insane. So we're excited about that, and planning and everything that revolved around that. And then as far as ministry, I'll do that one second. And so, I've got a couple things that I want to see happen in our church. One is we're getting ready to start some new D groups, or kind of our mid-year modules, fewer in mid-year, but we're getting ready to start a couple new discipleship groups. I'm looking forward to multiplying those at the end of the year. But one thing that is my goal that I want to see happen, if there's one thing that our church, I think, desperately needs to do better, and that is, we need some people that are equipped and that are actively engaged in sharing their faith. We need more people who are, confident, competent, and consistent in sharing their faith. And so that was kind of my vision really at the beginning of the year. And so I'm really, the next 6 months, my goal is that we have 25% of our church trained and equipped and engaged in actively sharing their faith on a regular basis. And so that's what I want to see happen the next 6 months. That's what I'm going to be working toward in everything that I do to make sure that happens. So
awesome.
We're excited about that. And then for the podcast, I'm with you, Andy. I just, we say this all the time, but I really do pinch myself and make sure that this is not a dream, because, 2 years ago it was, and God has blessed us. And so
it's a good thing we aren't in the same room, or I would just pinch you.
Yeah,
myself,
you would.
so,
That's right.
Yeah.
I say that only when we're not together.
Yeah.
But I'm looking forward to the guests that we're going to have the next 6 months, and meeting some new people. And here's what I want to tell you as we get ready to close, in fact, this episode. We really do want this podcast to encourage and equip you. But the other thing we want it to do is we want this to be a community for you. And our idea behind this podcast is we want to create a community. We talk about, the CLP Army, but we really do want to create that community of people that you can connect with one another, but you can connect with us, right? So Andy and I aren't these, we're not big wigs, right? We're pastors of normal.
I don't even
churches.
own a wig, Mark. So
maybe we need to think about shopping.
Maybe I need to have a wig. I don't know.
But we're not these important people that don't have time for you. Okay. That's our heartbeat. That's our passion. And if we can meet you, if we can encourage you personally, we want to do that, even if it's over text or email or whatever. And so we say this all the time, but get in touch with us. Contact at churchleadershippodcast.com.
If you have like a mountain cabin or a beach house, or a really nice condo in a large city, you just let us know. We'll make time.
Yeah, you're the front of the line. We're just saying.
But no, it doesn't matter. What Mark's talking about is true. We really, if it's a phone call, if it's a cup of coffee, we'll be glad to not just connect with you, but have a conversation where you give an ear to what you have to say. One of the things Mark and I love to do is we have many times a little bit of a mini gripe session when we haven't connected in a while. We did that just earlier, kind of dealt with some things and got it off our chest, and now we can move on. So maybe you don't have somebody like that. So we'd be glad to listen to you, just to share anything that you need to share. If there's something we can pray for you about or help you with, we'll be glad to do that. Absolutely.
Yeah. And a suggestion for the podcast. Got a question that you'd like to see addressed? We'd love to hear that. So contact at churchleadershippodcast.com. Make sure you reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. So I hope that our conversation today has been encouraging and equipping as you lead the local church, as you catch up with us, as we get to catch up with you. And we're excited to be able to do this every week. So we're glad you joined our conversation today, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining us on the Church Leadership Podcast, sponsored by and brought to you by the Church Leadership Podcast.
That's it. See you guys.